On the morning of April 18th, 1943, 16 American fighters came up out of the haze above the jungle of Bougainville. They had crossed more than 300 miles of open ocean, flying so low their propellers tore spray off the water. They had held radio silence the entire way. And they arrived at the exact minute they meant to arrive. They were not lost. They were not lucky. Somebody had told them where to be. Inside the bomber they were hunting sat a man who had spent 2 years living in America. He had rented a room in a quiet suburb outside Boston. He had learned poker from American classmates and sat up all night taking their money. He had ridden across that country in the cars of strangers, looking at oil, and he had come home with an answer that nobody in Tokyo wanted to hear. Ask him whether Japan could beat the United States, and he would tell you no. He told the Prime Minister no. He told the Navy Ministry no. He said he could run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year. And after that, he had utterly no confidence. Then they ordered him to plan the attack on Pearl Harbor, and he did it better than any man alive could have done it. His name meant 56. He had been named after a number, and numbers were the only thing he ever truly trusted. Did you grow up hearing stories about World War II? Press 1 for yes. A 2 for no. Nagaoka sits in the snow country of Niigata, on the wrong side of the mountains from Tokyo. In winter, the drifts climb the walls of the houses and reach the second-floor windows, and the people who come from that place carry a reputation across Japan for stubbornness, not warmth, not charm, endurance. The kind of hardness that outsiders mistake for coldness until they need something from it. On the 4th of April, 1884, in a house in that town, a boy was born to a man named Sadayoshi Takano. Takano had been a samurai once, but the world that paid samurai had ended. The stipends were gone. The swords were going, and men of his class had been left holding a name and almost nothing else. He was old by the time this child came. He was 56 years old on the day his son arrived in the world. The old man looked down at the infant, and he named him Isoroku. It means 56. Sit with that for a moment. Not a name chosen for its beauty. Not a name carrying an ancestor's honor forward. Not a name that asks the gods for anything at all. A number, the father's age, written down and handed to the child like a receipt for a transaction already completed. The boy who would one day calculate the death of an empire and get the answer right to within a matter of days was given a number for a name before he ever opened his eyes. He grew up in a house where the money did not stretch. That leaves marks on a child, and it left them on this one, not bitterness, something colder and more useful than bitterness. He learned early to count what was actually in front of him rather than what he wished was there. It is a small habit in a boy. In a grown man commanding a fleet, it becomes something else entirely. He went into the Imperial Naval Academy, and he came out in 1904, 11th in his class. He was 20 years old, and the timing of that could not have been better or worse, depending on how you look at it. Because Japan was about to fight Russia, nobody expected Japan to win. Russia was an empire that ran from Poland to the Pacific. Japan was an island nation that had been opening its ports to foreigners for barely 50 years. The bookmakers of Europe would have laughed at the odds, and Japan won anyway. The moment it happened had a name, Tsushima Mai, 1905. The Russian Baltic Fleet had sailed most of the way around the planet to reach the fight. 18,000 miles of ocean, their hulls fouled, their crews exhausted, their coal running low. Admiral Togo was waiting for them in the strait between Japan and Korea. What followed was not a battle so much as an execution. Togo destroyed almost the entire Russian fleet in 2 days. Japan lost 3 torpedo boats. It was one of the most complete naval victories in the history of the world. And every Japanese officer who lived through it took a lesson from it that would still be killing Japanese boys 40 years later. The lesson was, This spirit beats steel. Well, beats numbers. A people who want it badly enough can overcome any material disadvantage because there is something in the Japanese soul that machinery cannot measure. That is what the nation learned at Tsushima. Ensign Isoroku Takano learned something different. He was a signalman aboard the armored cruiser Nishin. He was 21 years old, standing on the deck of a warship in the middle of the greatest victory his country had ever won. And then the forward turret exploded, not from Russian fire. The gun blew itself apart. Understand what that means. It was not a shell from an enemy ship. It was not the Tsar's navy reaching out across the water to hurt him. It was Japanese steel, Japanese powder, Japanese engineering, failing under Japanese hands. The weapon killed its own crew. He went down. When they picked him up, the index and middle fingers of his left hand were gone. There was a wound in his thigh. They later described as being the size of a baby's head. So there he was, a young officer, bleeding on the deck of a ship that was winning. All around him, the nation was learning the Japanese spirit could beat anything. And he was lying there missing 2 fingers. And the thing that took them was not the enemy. It was his own country's machinery coming apart because it was not good enough. He never wrote a speech about it. He never made it into a parable. But look at the rest of his life and ask yourself whether he ever really forgot it. For the next decade, he was simply an officer, climbing slowly, doing the work. Then in 1916, something happened that would seem strange to Western eyes and was perfectly ordinary in Japan. The Yamamoto family had no son. That was a crisis. In Japan, a family name is not a decoration. It is a line. And a line that ends is a kind of death that outlives the people who die. So the Yamamotos did what families in their position did. They adopted an adult. They found a grown man of good stock and good prospects, and they gave him the name. The man they chose was 32 years old, missing 2 fingers, and going nowhere in particular. Isoroku Takano became Yamamoto Isoroku. Think about the sequence. He was named for his father's age. Then he was handed a different family's name entirely. The man had almost no say in what he was called. Both times, someone else decided who he would be. He simply took the assignment and went to work. Remember that when we get to the part where they order him to attack Pearl Harbor, in 1918, he married a woman named Reiko Mihashi. They had 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters. It was a proper marriage, a correct marriage, and it is not the relationship that anyone remembers about him. Then came June of 1919, and the order that made the rest of the story possible, report to Harvard University. He was 35 years old. He crossed the Pacific and the American continent and arrived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and took a room in Brookline, a quiet suburb of good houses and old trees where nothing dangerous had ever happened. He was enrolled as a special student. His subject officially was English. There were about 70 other Japanese at Harvard in those years. They went to their classes. They did their reading. They got their marks. Yamamoto did not, because he had not come to Harvard to learn English. He had come to Harvard because Harvard had a library, and the library had numbers in it. He spent his time on economics, and on one subject above all others, oil. You have to understand why Japan is a chain of volcanic islands. It has rice, it has fish, it has people, it has mountains, and it has almost no petroleum whatsoever. And the Navy that Japan had spent 40 years building, the Navy that had annihilated the Russians at Tsushima, run on oil. Every ship, every engine, every hour at sea, a country with no oil had built a fleet that drank it. And the country that had the oil, the country that pumped it out of the ground in quantities that made the rest of the world look like it was working with an eyedropper, was the United States of America. So he read about production, he read about refining, He read about how much came out of the ground and how fast and who owned it. And the numbers he found in that library were not opinions. They could not be argued with. They could not be overcome by the Japanese soul. That was the first thing America taught him. The second thing America taught him happened at a card table. His classmates introduced him to poker, and something in the man caught fire. He played like it mattered. He stayed up through the night, hand after hand, and he won. He kept winning. For the rest of his life, bridge and poker would earn him a serious second income, which tells you something about how good he actually was. But the cards were never the point. What he was doing at those tables was reading Americans. He was watching how they bet, how they bluffed, how they handled a loss. And he was learning something that no library could have given him, because it was not written down anywhere. He learned that Americans bet big. He learned that they lost big and stayed at the table and ordered another drink and kept playing, because losing did not frighten them the way it frightened men from a small, poor island. He learned that the player with the deepest stack does not have to win every hand. He only has to keep sitting there until the other man runs out. And then, in the summers, he went out and looked at the country itself. He rode across America in the cars of strangers, hitchhiking, with very little money and no official capacity, a foreign naval officer with 2 fingers missing from one hand, watching the United States go by through a windshield. He was not looking at forts. He was not counting battleships. That was not where the answer was. He was looking at ordinary things, roads, farms, filling stations. The number of automobiles that regular people owned and drove without thinking about it, the casual, thoughtless, everyday abundance of a nation that had never once had to ration anything that mattered. In July of 1921, he sailed home. He had gone to America to learn English, and he had done that badly. What he brought back instead was arithmetic, a conclusion, a number sitting in his head that would not move no matter how he turned it. He had the answer to a question that Japan had not yet worked up the courage to ask. It would be 20 years before anybody asked it. And when they finally did, they would not like what he said. In January of 1926, Yamamoto came back to America. He was a captain. Now, he was 41 years old. And this time he did not come as a student, sleeping in a rented room and riding in strangers' cars. He came as the naval attaché of the Empire of Japan, posted to Washington with a title and an office and a government behind him. His English was fluent now, not textbook English, working English. He could sit in a room full of American officers and follow every word, including the words they said quietly to each other when they assumed the foreigner was not really listening. He stayed 2 years, and what happened inside him during those 2 years is the hinge that the entire rest of this story turns on, because it is not what you would expect, and almost everybody gets it wrong. Here is what people assume. They assumed that Yamamoto looked at the United States Navy and was frightened of it. He was not. He thought it was a joke. He watched the American Naval Officer Corps up close for 2 solid years, at their conferences and their dinners and their social functions. And he came away with something close to contempt. In his estimation, the United States Navy was not a fighting service at all. It was a club for men who played golf and played bridge and drew a salary and had never in their lives been asked to do anything difficult. He had seen the Russian fleet die at Tsushima. He had felt his own ship's turret come apart under his hand. He looked at these comfortable Americans in their good uniforms, and he was not impressed. And this is the part that matters. This is the thing that makes him different from every other admiral in Tokyo. Yamamoto was terrified of America anyway, not of its navy, of everything behind its navy, because he had already done the reading. He had spent 2 years at Harvard with his head in the numbers, and now he was living inside the machine. Those numbers described and he could see the thing his colleagues could not see. The American Navy was almost irrelevant. It was a small, soft, badly used tool sitting on top of the largest industrial engine that had ever existed on the face of the earth. The danger was not the officers. The danger was the country underneath them. The danger was oil coming out of the ground in quantities Japan could not imagine. The danger was factories and the men who ran them, and the fact that those factories were currently making automobiles and refrigerators and could be turned to making something else whenever the mood struck. The danger was 100 million people and more, none of whom had ever been hungry. And you could see it. That was the thing. You did not need a spy or a stolen document or a secret map. You did not need to break into anywhere. The evidence was lying in the street in front of you. Every hour of every day, and nobody in America even noticed it was there. It was in the way the lights stayed on. It was in the heat in the buildings in February, poured out into rooms nobody was sitting in. Because heat was cheap and nobody had ever had to think about it. It was in the shops. It was in the sheer, stupid, careless volume of things, stacked up and marked down and thrown away. In a country that had never in living memory been made to choose between two things. Yamamoto had been born in a house in the snow country where nothing was thrown away because there was nothing to throw. He had grown up counting what was actually on the table, and now he walked around a capital city where the waste alone would have kept his childhood village through a winter, and not one American he met considered it remarkable. That is what frightened him, not the gun, the ease. And Yamamoto understood the ugly arithmetic that follows from that. A soft navy can be beaten. A soft navy can be beaten twice. But if the country behind it decides to get serious, it will simply build another navy, and then another, and it will keep building them long after your last ship is on the bottom and your last pilot is dead. He had learned this at a card table in Cambridge, and he never forgot it. The player with the deepest stack does not need to be a better player. He only needs to still be sitting there when you run out. Japan was playing with borrowed money against a man who owned the building. So he went home in 1928 carrying the most valuable strategic intelligence any Japanese officer possessed, which was simply this: we cannot win, and nobody wanted it. Start with the thing he was right about that had nothing to do with America. Yamamoto believed in aircraft. He believed that the age of the battleship was finished, that the great steel castles the world's navies were pouring their treasure into were expensive coffins, and that the future of war at sea belonged to the airplane and the carrier that launched it. He was correct. He was correct years before he had any right to be correct. And in the Japanese Navy of the 1930s, saying it out loud made you a crank. The Navy had a plan. It had had the same plan for decades. The plan was that one day the American fleet would come across the Pacific and Japan would meet it, and there would be one enormous decisive battle between lines of battleships, another Tsushima, and Japan would win because Japan had won before. Everything was built around that fantasy. The ships, the training, the budget, careers had been made on it. Old men had grown old inside it, and here was Yamamoto saying the whole thing was obsolete. Then it got worse, because he started talking about the war itself. In 1931, the Army seized Manchuria. In 1937, Japan went into China proper, and the killing started in earnest. And the nation began sliding down a slope. It was never going to climb back up. Yamamoto opposed all of it, not on the grounds you might hope for. He was not a pacifist, and he never pretended to be. He opposed it because he had done the sum, and the sum did not work. A war in China would drag on. A war in China would put Japan on a collision course with Washington, and a collision with Washington was a collision with those factories and those oil fields, and he had seen them. And then came 1940, and the tripartite pact, and Yamamoto stopped being merely inconvenient and became a problem that people wanted solved. The pact would bind Japan to Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, to the army and to the young hot officers, and to a very large slice of the Japanese public. This was obvious and glorious. Germany was winning. France had fallen in 6 weeks. Britain was alone and looked finished. Why not stand with the winners? Yamamoto said no. He said it in rooms where saying it cost him something, and he was not alone. There were 2 other admirals who stood with him, Mitsumasa Yonai and Shigeyoshi Inoue, and the 3 of them made the same argument over and over to men who had stopped listening years earlier. Tie yourself to Germany. They said, and you tie yourself to Germany's enemies, you will end up at war with the United States, and you cannot win a war with the United States. They lost the argument, and this is where the story stops being about policy and starts being about a man's life. The hate mail began arriving, not a trickle, a steady daily flow of it, addressed to the admiral personally from Japanese citizens and Japanese officers, promising him what was going to happen to him. He was a coward. He was a traitor. He had lived in America and he had been contaminated by it. He drank their coffee and read their magazines and played their card games, and now he was doing their work for them. Here, inside the empire, wearing a Japanese uniform, you have to understand what an assassination threat meant in Japan in those years. It was not rhetoric. Japan had spent the 1930s killing its own moderates. Prime ministers had been shot in their own homes by young officers who then explained calmly that they had done it out of love for the nation. Cabinet ministers had been murdered. The men who pulled the triggers had been treated as patriots by half the country. This was a system that had already proven exactly what it was willing to do to people who said inconvenient things, and there was money on the table. Word went around that there was a reward waiting for whoever took care of the admiral. Imagine living inside that. Every morning the letters come. Some of them are from strangers, and some of them are from men who wear the same uniform you wear and salute the same flag. They describe what they are going to do to you. They tell you the day is coming, and you sit there and you read them, and then you put them down and you go to work. And the men you pass in the corridor may be the ones who wrote them. He was not a young man anymore. He was in his middle 50s. He had given that Navy his whole life. He had left 2 fingers on the deck of a cruiser for it when he was 21 years old. And this was the return on it. A country that had decided the most dangerous thing a man could do was tell the truth about a sum. So they fortified the Navy ministry. Read that again, because it is one of the most extraordinary facts of this entire story, and it is almost never told. They put machine guns inside the Navy Ministry of the Empire of Japan. They brought in tanks, not against the Americans. There was no war with America. The American fleet was thousands of miles away and no threat to a building in Tokyo. Those guns were pointed at Japanese people. Those tanks were there in case Japanese soldiers came to kill Japanese admirals for the crime of saying that Japan should not start a war it was going to lose. That is the condition of a country in the autumn of 1940. It has become dangerous to be right, and what did Yamamoto do about it? Nothing. That is the strange, cold, revealing thing about the man. He knew what was coming for him, and he did not run, and he did not soften his position, and he did not go quiet. He simply carried on and accepted that one day it would happen. His attitude toward being murdered was passive, almost administrative, as though his own death were a line item that had already been entered in a ledger somewhere, and there was no particular use arguing about it. He had been named for a number. He had spent his life trusting numbers, and the numbers said he was probably going to be killed. Yonai looked at the situation and did the sum himself. And he came to a conclusion that has a terrible weight to it. He believed that if Yamamoto stayed on shore, he would be dead before the year was out, not eventually before the end of 1939. So on the 30th of August, 1939. As one of his last acts, Yonai gave Yamamoto the greatest command in the Japanese Navy. Commander-in-Chief of the combined fleet, every fighting ship Japan possessed, the most powerful appointment an officer of that Navy could ever receive, the summit of a lifetime's career, and a large part of the reason he got it was that a warship is harder to break into than a house. They did not promote him. They hid him. They took the man who insisted the war could not be won, and they put him at sea, out of reach of the assassins. And the price of his life was that he now personally commanded the instrument that would fight the war he said could not be won. Understand the shape of what has just happened. The only senior officer in Japan who genuinely understood the enemy has been given the fleet, not because they agreed with him, because they needed to get him out of Tokyo before somebody shot him. He knew exactly what it was. He took it anyway. And then Prince Konoe, the Prime Minister of Japan, asked him a direct question. Kono wanted to know what would happen if it came to it, if Japan and the United States went to war. What were the chances? He was asking the one man in the country who had actually been there, who had read the production figures in an American library, who had watched Americans lose money at cards and shrug, who had ridden through that endless country in the back of strangers' automobiles and looked out the window at the farms, and Yamamoto did not soften it. He said that if he was told to fight, he would run wild considerably for the first 6 months or a year. But for the second year and the third, he had utterly no confidence. Listen to what that actually is. The commander-in-chief of the combined fleet of the Empire of Japan is telling the Prime Minister of Japan to his face that Japan will lose, not that it might lose, not that it would be difficult. He is giving the man a schedule, 6 months of victories, then nothing, then defeat. Any nation with sense would have stopped there. Your best admiral, the one who knows the enemy personally, has just handed you a defeat notice before a single shot has been fired. And notice what he did not say. He did not say it would be hard. He did not say it would be costly, or that it would take everything or any of the other things a professional says when he wants to sound serious without actually committing to anything. He did not leave himself a door. He gave the man a length of time, and then he told him there was nothing on the other side of it. 6 months, maybe a year. Then he had utterly no confidence. There is no way to hear that except one way, and Canoe heard it. Everyone in that room heard it. Japan heard it, and Japan went ahead. So now we arrive at the thing that makes Yamamoto one of the strangest figures of the entire war. And the reason people still argue about him almost a century later, he knew the war was lost. He said so to everyone who would listen and to plenty who would not. He said so to the Prime Minister, and then he sat down and planned Pearl Harbor. And he did not do it badly or slowly or with sabotage in his heart. He did it brilliantly. He fought for it. He forced it through against furious opposition from his own service. He wanted it. On the 7th of January, 1941, he put it on paper and sent it to the Navy Minister, Koshiro Oikawa. The document had a title so boring that your eye slides off it. Views on military preparations. It sounds like a memorandum about fuel storage or officer training or the budget for new boilers. Inside, it was a plan to destroy the United States Pacific Fleet at anchor. And he asked for something else in that document, something that tells you he was not a man being dragged along. He asked to command the attacking fleet himself. Personally, he wanted to be the one who did it. The Naval General Staff hated it. You should understand the reasoning, because it was not stupid. The plan was an enormous gamble. It would send every fleet carrier Japan owned across thousands of miles of the Pacific in secret, in Vinta, and if the Americans found them on the way, Japan would lose its entire naval air arm in an afternoon, and the war would be over before it started. And on top of that, the whole thing was a distraction. The war Japan actually needed to fight was in the south, for the oil of the Dutch East Indies. Hawaii was a sideshow. They fought him for months, and Yamamoto, who was supposed to be the reluctant one, the reasonable one, the man who did not want this war at all, reached for the ugliest weapon available to him. He threatened to resign. Think about the position he had put them in. He was the most popular officer in the fleet. If he walked out publicly on the eve of a war, the Navy would tear itself apart. They could not afford to lose him, and they could not afford to have him standing outside the tent saying what he thought. So they gave in. The plan was finally accepted at the end of September or the beginning of October, 1941. 2 months before the attack, 2 months. Now hold both halves of this man in your head at once, because this is who he actually was. He believed the war would destroy Japan. He said it out loud, repeatedly, at genuine risk to his own life, until his own government had to garrison a building against his own countrymen. And when he could not stop the war, he did not resign in protest. He did not go quiet. He took the fleet, designed the most audacious opening blow in the history of naval warfare, and blackmailed his superiors into approving it. He was not a peace advocate. He was never a peace advocate. He was an accountant. He opposed the war because he had run the numbers. And the numbers said Japan loses. That is all. It was never about morality, and he never claimed it was. And once the decision was made over his objections, the same arithmetic pointed somewhere else. If Japan must fight a war it cannot win, then the only hope, the only thin, cold sliver of a chance, is to hit the Americans so hard and so early that they decide the price is not worth paying and come to the table. It probably will not work. But it is the only line on the page that is not zero. So he took it because that is what the numbers said to do. There was one person he told the truth to. Her name was Chiyoko Kawai. She was a geisha, and he was closer to her than he ever was to the wife he had married in 1918. He wrote to her. He kept writing to her for years through everything that was coming. Picture the man in the last weeks before the world changed. He is the most powerful admiral in Japan. He commands every ship his country owns. His government has just approved his plan. His nation adores him, and he is writing letters to a woman because there is nobody else on earth he can say it to. Not to his staff. They are watching him for confidence, and he has to give them confidence because a fleet that senses doubt in its commander is already beaten. Not to his wife, not to the Navy minister who has heard it and filed it, not to the Prime Minister who asked and was told and did it anyway, not to the young officers who worship him and would be genuinely bewildered to learn what he actually thought. Because in their minds, he is the great hawk, the man who forced the boldest plan in Japanese history past a timid general staff. They have it exactly backwards, and he cannot tell them. So there is one woman, and there is paper, and there is a pen. That is the whole of it. That is what the most feared naval officer in the Pacific had left. He is 57 years old. He has 2 fingers missing from his left hand, taken by a Japanese gun. He has a fleet given to him so that Japanese assassins could not reach him. And he has a number in his head that he has been carrying since he was a young man in a library in Massachusetts. And the number has never once moved. 6 months. He had told them, he had told all of them, and now the ships were loading. It worked. That is the part people forget. On the 7th of December, 1941, the plan that Yamamoto had forced through a hostile general staff by threatening to walk out worked almost exactly the way he drew it. 2,403 Americans died that morning. Another 1,178 were wounded. 4 battleships went to the bottom of the harbor, and 4 more were torn open. 188 aircraft were destroyed, most of them sitting in neat rows on the ground, parked wingtip to wingtip to protect them from sabotage. Japan lost 29 aircraft and 64 men. By any measure a professional would use, it was one of the most successful operations ever conducted at sea. He had sent his carriers across thousands of miles of winter ocean without being seen, and he had caught the United States Pacific Fleet asleep at its moorings, and he had wrecked it in under 2 hours for the price of a few dozen airplanes. Japan went out of its mind with joy. There were crowds. There was cheering in the streets. The arrogant Americans had been shown, at last, what they were worth. The white men would be driven out of Asia. Every newspaper in the country ran the numbers on the front page, and the numbers were beautiful. And Yamamoto went to his cabin a month later, on the 9th of January, 1942. He was talking to a man named Ogata Takatora, the editor-in-chief of the Asahi Shimbun, one of the largest newspapers in Japan. This was a man whose job was to sell the victory to the public. He had come to hear the great admiral describe his triumph. Here's what the great admiral said to him: "A military man can scarcely pride himself on having smitten a sleeping enemy. It is more a matter of shame, simply, for the one smitten. I would rather you made your appraisal after seeing what the enemy does, since it is certain that, angered and outraged, he will soon launch a determined counterattack." Read it again. That is the architect of Pearl Harbor telling the editor of a national newspaper, 5 weeks after the greatest victory in Japanese naval history, that there is nothing here to be proud of and that the bill is coming. Now, you may have heard a different line. You may have heard that Yamamoto said he feared he had awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve. It is a magnificent sentence. It has been quoted in 1,000 documentaries. He never said it. There is no evidence he ever said it, wrote it, or thought it. It was written for him decades later for a film. Somebody put those words in a dead man's mouth, and the world has been repeating them ever since. And the strange thing is that the real words are worse, because the invented quote is a man expressing fear. The real one is a man expressing shame, and then telling you flatly, without drama, exactly what is going to happen next. He had said 6 months, so they got 6 months. Singapore fell, and the fortress that Britain said could never fall fell in a week. The Philippines fell, the Dutch East Indies fell, and with them the oil that the whole war had been about. Within half a year, the Empire of Japan stretched from the frontier of India to the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and it had been assembled at a speed that made the Germans look slow. Hey, Ramwild, exactly as advertised. And then it was the 4th of June, 1942. Midway, count the months yourself. December to June. It is 6, not approximately 6. 4 Japanese fleet carriers went down in a single day. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, the heart of the naval air arm, the ships that had made Pearl Harbor possible, the finest carrier force in the world, gone between breakfast and dinner. Japan could not replace them. It did not have the yards. It did not have the steel. And above all, it did not have the pilots. Those men had taken a decade to train, and they were on the bottom of the ocean. The clock he had set in front of the Prime Minister of Japan had just run out. On schedule to the month. But here is the thing that ought to stop you cold. He was wrong, not about the outcome, about the reason. Yamamoto had spent his adult life doing one calculation: steel, oil, factories, production. He had gone to the library, and he had gone to the card table, and he had ridden across America in strangers' cars, and he had come home with an equation that said Japan loses because Japan cannot build what America can build. And he was right about all of it. Every figure held, but that is not what killed his carriers at Midway. What killed them was that the Americans were reading his mail. They had broken the Japanese naval code, JN 25. They knew he was coming. They knew roughly when, and they knew where. And so 3 American carriers were waiting in a piece of ocean the size of a continent at exactly the right hour. It was not production that beat him that day. It was not oil. It was mathematics of a different kind entirely, done by exhausted men in a basement in Hawaii. He had measured everything American except their minds. He thought their Navy was a club for golfers and bridge players. He had watched those officers for 2 years, and he had decided they were soft. And it turned out that some of those comfortable Americans in their good uniforms could sit in a windowless room and pull his intentions out of the air. That was the one number he never ran. And it is the number that killed him on the 14th of April, 1943. American codebreakers pulled a message out of the traffic. It was an itinerary. The commander-in-chief of the combined fleet was going to inspect forward positions in the Solomon Islands. It gave the date, the route, and the times. They knew where Yamamoto would be on the 18th of April. And they knew what minute he would be there. He was famously, rigidly punctual. His staff had built the schedule around it. His entire life had been an argument for precision, for the things you can count and rely on, and precision was about to be the death of him. A less exact man would have lived. 16 P-38 Lightnings made it to the interception point after crossing more than 300 miles of open water. They flew at wave height the whole way, in radio silence, navigating by compass and clock across an ocean with nothing to steer by. And they arrived at the exact moment his aircraft came over the coast of Bougainville. Lieutenant Rex Barber put his fire into the bomber carrying the Admiral. It went down into the jungle. They found him the next day. A search party under a lieutenant named Tsuyoshi Hamasuna cut its way in through the trees and reached the wreck. And there he was. 2 rounds of .50 caliber had hit him. One in the left shoulder and one in the left jaw. And it was the second one that had killed him. He was 59 years old. Think about the hands they found him with. The left one was still missing 2 fingers. 38 years after a Japanese gun took them off a young signalman who was standing on the deck of a cruiser watching his country win the most famous victory in its history. Those 2 fingers had been gone longer than most of the pilots who flew for him had been alive. He carried that hand through Harvard and through Washington and through every argument he ever lost in Tokyo, and he was still carrying it in a wrecked bomber in the jungle of Bougainville, on the far edge of an empire that was already dying exactly the way he said it would. The gun that maimed him was Japanese, so was the war. Consider the arithmetic of the man's whole life. He was named for a number because that was how old his father was on the day he was born. And nobody thought to give him anything more than that. He lost 2 fingers at 21, and they were not taken by an enemy. They were taken by a Japanese gun that came apart in a Japanese turret, in the middle of the greatest victory Japan had ever won. While the rest of the nation was learning the exact opposite lesson from the one he learned, he went to America to study English and studied oil instead. And the oil told him the truth. He told the truth to a prime minister and got hate mail for it. And machine guns went into the Navy ministry to protect Japanese admirals from Japanese patriots. And the greatest command in the fleet was handed to him partly as a way of keeping him alive. He said 6 months, and he got 6 months to the month, and then he was shot out of the sky because someone had read a schedule he never imagined anyone could read. He was not a good man, and he was not a peaceful one. He never claimed to be either. He was a gambler who took a great deal of money off his friends. He kept a mistress and wrote to her because there was no one else. And when his country ordered him to start a war he was certain would destroy it, he did not refuse. He built the finest opening blow anyone had ever designed, and he forced it through by threatening to quit, and 2,403 Americans died on a Sunday morning because he was good at his job. That is the whole tragedy. Not that he was ignored, and then obeyed. Japan had one man who had actually seen the enemy, one man who had done the sum honestly and carried the answer home. It did not have to look far. He was standing right there in the room, saying it out loud, at the risk of his own life. For years, they put guns in a building to keep him alive so that he could lead them into the thing he told them not to do. He was right about the ships and right about the oil and right about the factories and right about the 6 months. He was right about everything he ever counted, and it did not save one single life. Not theirs, not his